Upon the resignation of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford assumes the presidency. As I mentioned in the previous segment, he's a congressman from Michigan. He is likable. He has a reputation of being a decent man, but perhaps not brilliant, trustworthy, but perhaps more physical than intellectual. As president, he made any number of endearing, at times, snafus, mess ups. Some were verbal, like the one I just had, and some were physical, including falling down a flight of stairs. As Ford himself put it, he was, quote, a Ford, not a Lincoln. August the 9th, 1974, he became president. And about a month later, on September the 8th, 1974, he did something that would really color his presidency, I think, for many in the American public, and that is he granted Richard Nixon a full pardon for any crimes he may have committed as president. A full pardon means that Nixon will never really be punished for whatever actions he may have undertaken, but more importantly, that there's a sort of lack of closure for the American people, that sense of justice served. On the other hand, Ford argued that the best thing for the United States was to put the whole episode behind it, that it ought to be set aside, forgotten, and divisions healed for the best interests of the country. I'll let you decide. In legislative terms, Ford in some ways proved more conservative than Nixon had been. But a powerful Democratic Congress, made more powerful by Nixon's own activities and the subsequent Watergate hearings, was able to pass quite a lot of its own legislation in spite of Gerald Ford and his own ideological feelings. Very quick kind of rendition here of the Ford presidency. Soaring fuel prices that had been such a big deal, 73, 74 with the embargo, and massive inflation led Gerald Ford to launch a program called WIN, W-I-N, which stands for, it's an acronym for Whip Inflation Now. That was launched in October of 1974. Ford sought to cut federal spending in order to reduce inflation and endorsed the raising of the discount rate, that is, the rate charged by the Federal Reserve to lending institutions, right? The idea is that you could use interest rates to slow down the economy and thus slow down inflation. The problem, if I may, is that this isn't inflation in a growing economy. This is stagflation, and you have an apathetic sort of economy in which you have the oddity of inflation. So by trying to stop runaway inflation, which it's not unimportant, Ford has a rather negative impact, arguably, on the American economy and its growth. Meanwhile, as I've already suggested, industrial cities like Detroit are becoming part of the larger Rust Belt. Gas prices have begun to hurt automobile sales, and that's reverberating through the economy in sectors like steel. Plus, the competition of new and smaller, more fuel-efficient Japanese cars in particular are beginning to affect the American market. All of this is adding to those themes I mentioned earlier, the shifts that are occurring to seek greater efficiency in American industry. As far as Ford's foreign policy, he continued to work with Henry Kissinger to develop détente. He made progress on a follow-up to the SALT I treaty, known as SALT II, that would have limited the arsenal of missiles on both sides, but SALT II was not completed during Ford's administration. He did, however, manage to secure with the Soviet Union the so-called Helsinki Accords, going back to Helsinki, Finland, where there were meetings about these agreements, the so-called Accords, Helsinki Accords. These agreements effectively formalized the division of Europe that had existed since World War II. But it also required of the signees certain standards in terms of the observation of human rights. Arguably, the Soviet Union in particular signed off without any real desire to follow through. But it did spur on some reforms within the Soviet sphere. And by Soviet sphere, of course, Eastern Europe. Perhaps the most glaring foreign policy event of the Ford presidency occurred in April of 1975. I mean, think about it. Nixon resigns, 74, 75, the government of South Vietnam falls to North Vietnamese forces. As was much of the war, it's recorded on TV, and the images are haunting. Images of the last Americans being airlifted out, but also refugees, South Vietnamese folks who had worked with the Americans as counterparts and colleagues, and now were in fear for their very lives as North Vietnamese forces approached the southern or South Vietnamese city of Saigon, which ultimately would be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. It was a desperate flight as South Vietnamese forces just began to crumble. And I remember distinctly, and you've probably seen them too, but images of American Huey helicopters used to transport refugees out of Saigon, out of South Vietnam, landing on carriers stationed offshore. And because there just wasn't enough space, whole helicopters being pushed off the side of aircraft carrier decks to make room for more. 1976 marked not only the 200th birthday of the United States, was a bicentennial year, but it was also a presidential election year. Gerald Ford, you'll recall, had come to the presidency from the vice presidency when Richard Nixon resigned in 1974 and had rather a short administration of his own. It's notable that in 1976, Ford was threatened by an insurgency within the Republican Party, led, or at least the figurehead of this insurgency was the governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Reagan represented the emergence of sort of the new conservatism in Republican politics in a big way. And 1976 is sort of the opening. Barry Goldwater had demonstrated this level of conservatism in 64. Nixon had played on that in 68. Reagan represents this conservatism outright. He is sort of the figure, the symbol who will come to represent the conservative ideal within the Republican Party. It's worth noting that he had been an actor in his previous manifestation before getting into politics. Gerald Ford manages to hold off this insurgency and hold off Ronald Reagan. But interestingly enough, he allows Reagan to speak at the Republican convention in 1976. And lo and behold, Reagan comes out and he just gives this powerful speech. And it's right after the delegates had nominated as their candidate for the presidency Gerald Ford. And there is this thought that seems to go around the convention center, which is, wow, did we just nominate the wrong person? Maybe so for 76. But Ronald Reagan will return, of course, in 1980. Ford holds off that challenge, but he doesn't hold off a challenge from the Democratic Party. And that challenge comes from Plains, Georgia, of all places. A peanut farmer by trade from Plains, Georgia, named James Earl Jimmy Carter. And the Jimmy is very important because Carter would run as a sort of populist outsider, a man of the people who was just one of you and who would bring that common sense attitude to the corruption and the vile power plays of Washington that were exemplified by Richard Nixon, right? He's an outsider. Carter's an outsider. He's going to make it right. He's going to clean it up. So he's almost from the beginning running first as a populist, but also on a sort of moral platform. It's notable, too, that Carter is an engineer by training. He is an a terribly intelligent man, but an engineer. He had served in the United States Navy, educated as an engineer, had worked on nuclear power. And then he returns to Georgia, and he gets involved in politics at the local level first, primarily because of his dissatisfaction with conservatism in local elections. It's sort of an old conservatism. It's that states' rights conservatism. And there were things Carter wanted to see done. One of the things that changes the situation, that allows a Jimmy Carter to emerge in Georgia, going back to the Supreme Court decision in 1962, Baker versus Carr, which basically dealt with apportionment. It dealt with how votes had to be apportioned according to population. And the basic theme of Baker v. Carr is one person, one vote. Georgia had used up through the 1960s the county unit system, so that votes were really calculated by county. You won the county. Votes were not considered on an individual basis. Carter would begin to make a name. A lot of hard work, a lot of long nights campaigning and trying to keep the farm going, but he would gradually move up until he becomes the governor of Georgia. And as the governor, he shows himself to be a fiscal conservative. That means financially, he's quite conservative. But at minimum, a very moderate figure among Southern governors on the issues of race. He promoted himself, as I said, as an outsider. And it's a fascinating rejuvenation of the Southern image in a way that occurs in the 1970s. Many of you will probably be familiar with the movie Smokey and the Bandit. In some sense, the outsider, the rebel image of the South, takes on a new vigor in response to the kind of counterculture's questioning of government, authority, standards. It's a fascinating juxtaposition, but not something we need to be talking about here. Early on, Carter develops a lead. It begins to narrow. He wins the election by a narrow majority, but it's notable that he sweeps the South. In terms of psychology, the fact he was an engineer and he had that sort of mentality is really quite important, because it leads Carter to look at problems individually in a technical sense, but it makes it very difficult, I think, for Jimmy Carter, who wanted so badly to relate to the people, to sort of develop broad themes that made an impact on the way people thought about these problems that confronted the United States. He was a detail-oriented kind of person, and he handled a lot of things himself. He had trouble, I think, he had problems delegating within his own administration. Even the smallest problems were of concern to Jimmy Carter. It's also important to note that Carter was a Southern Baptist, and that he connected with the growing kind of evangelical thread that was moving through conservatism. He was fiscally conservative and conservative enough from a moral standpoint that he could actually pull some support from evangelicals, particularly in the South. In terms of his policies, all of this is ultimately to be reflected. He proposes tax cuts, and he proposes public works programs. There's a second oil crisis in 1979. By 1980, interest rates, which were designed to hold down inflation, were approaching 20%. That's massive interest. But in spite of all this, prices continued upward, economic activity slowed, and the United States government increased its borrowing to offset losses of revenue. Carter's response was, quote, "Government cannot solve our problems." That's a conservative sentiment. That is the language of Ronald Reagan. Put quite differently, Put quite differently, when Reagan would go on to say that government, government's not the solution, government's the problem, and I'm paraphrasing there. But in essence, Carter's saying government may not be a problem, but it's not the solution either. And that is quite conservative. Think how activist government has been in the United States since the New Deal, but particularly since the 1960s and LBJ. So what does Carter attempt? He attempts civil service reform. He attempts national health insurance. He attempts welfare reform. He attempts to reform the income tax. And he fails. He doesn't have a good relationship with Congress. It just doesn't work well. He does manage to get a Department of Energy started. And the other thing I think Carter is going to be known for legislatively is his push, which is again very conservative, for deregulation. He will seek to limit, reduce, or end regulation in industries like the airlines and trucking and rail. This opens the door for much of the transportation world we see around us today, which by and large the airlines are no longer held to a certain standard of what they must provide to airline, to consumers. And that changes then the experience of consumers. If anybody's flown recently, we're paying to put bags on planes. And increasingly, we're paying for any little amenity that the airline provides. Airline travel used to be quite different in the United States. But the process of deregulation, the process of limiting government oversight, which had grown tremendously. Think about the passage of the Clean Air Act, right? The creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, even in the Nixon administration, had grown under Carter, and appealing here to conservatives in part. Under Carter, regulation is reduced, or that's the effort. The last segment, let's talk about foreign policy under Carter, and we'll wrap it up there.